Hello there. We are looking again at Bible translations. Last week I put up the video about what the different types of translations are and named a few different families and individual translations that are out there right now. So if you haven't seen that one already, you should probably check that one first so that you are familiar with the terms and whatnot that get used here. So now I wanted to bring up the question of choosing a Bible translation. How do I know what Bible to read? What kind, what version, what style of Bible? The questions like that. This is the practical advice section, if you like. So my assumption going into this is that you do not know how to read Greek, or Hebrew, or Aramaic, or Latin, or any other ancient language that early manuscripts of the Bible can be found in. If you can read those languages, you don't need my advice. So go away. Okay, I don't know. You already know the answer to this better. But if you don't read those languages and you only read English, or you want to read an English Bible, this is your video. Okay, so I have 4 pieces of advice. The first 2 are general advice for any Christian, you don't even have to be a Christian, what the heck, any reader, anyone who wants to read the Bible in English, and then 2 more pieces of advice that are Anglican specific. So if you're not an Anglican, well, don't skip those last questions, but you might not find those points as relevant to your particular situation. So, my first piece of advice for reading the Bible, or picking a translation. Pick one translation and stick with it for the long haul. Invest in it with your daily readings. Read the whole Bible all the way through before you change and pick a different translation. Read it for at least a year before you switch. Or maybe come back to it. Yeah, well, if you switch after a year, come back to it every other year, so that you start building on that. Or maybe just use a different translation every 3rd year. 2 years in one translation, the 3rd year exploring a different one. I make that my first piece of advice, sticking with one, because this is very, very important. Any musician knows, or any sportsman knows, that repetition is critical to developing the skills that you need. You practice your music over and over again. You drill your rudiments over and over again. You exercise. You practice. With the scriptures, if you stick with the same translation, you are building familiarity with the scriptures in that translation, and the potential for memorization is much greater. If you keep switching translations all the time, you will be hearing the Bible from different voices every time you change. And you have to start from scratch in terms of getting used to that particular voice. Now, if you switch around within the same translation family, as I discussed in the previous video, then the sort of voice won't change a whole lot, but it still is a change, and it's very, very much more helpful to stick with one. So pick one good translation, invest in it for your daily readings. And so because you're investing in just one, you want to make sure that you choose a solid translation, one that your pastor would recommend, one that is read in your church, one that a lot of mature Christians who are seasoned readers of the Bible would endorse. In many cases, including my own context, probably the top recommendation would be the English Standard Version, the ESV. And from that, you can infer also a general favor for the rest of the family of translations that it's a part of, like the NRSV, the RSV, or the King James Bible itself. So, pick a strong translation and stick with it. That is the most important thing. That's more important than which translation you choose, for the most part. The second piece of advice for choosing Bible translations is that when you're studying the Bible, not just daily readings, but really narrowing into study, choose two. Choose two different translations and make sure that they are different. Don't pick up the ESV and the RSV and say, all right, I'm going to study the Bible with these two translations. No, they are very closely related. Pick two different kinds. Pick one that is a paraphrase and one that's an imitation, or pick one that's more word for word style and one that's more phrase by phrase or thought for thought style. Pick up, the ESV on one side and the Message on the other. Pick up the King James on one side and the New Living Translation on the other. Or, grab like the Amplified Bible and contrast that with the NASB. So, things that are different. It's very helpful to compare and contrast because for the most part, there's more than one way to translate from one language to another. And, having different reliable voices is helpful for studying. So those are the first two important pieces of advice for how to go through and choose. Now, to number 3, we're getting into the Anglican specific stuff. All right, Anglicans, you're looking for a book, you're looking for a translation to read. All right, your first question is, does this translation come with the ecclesiastical books? By which I mean the books called Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books. Does your translation come with that? Because if it doesn't, you will not be able to finish the daily lectionary in your prayer book. Because we're Anglicans and we use those books, we read them. So make sure your Bible has them. If it doesn't have them, you're going to be stuck, usually toward the end of the year. Translations that have these books include the King James Bible, obviously, the RSV, including the Catholic edition of the RSV, although that doesn't have the exact same list that we have listed in our articles, so got to watch out there. The NRSV has those books. The ESV does in a very limited option, and it's not a really good copy, I have to admit, but at least it exists. And then there's also the New English Bible, the NEB, which is, from the mid-20th century. It's a little newer than the RSV, I think. But that was, I think, one of the first... I don't know. Anyway, NEB is another translation out there, although it's a bit older and harder to find. So those are some big questions there. Does it come with all the books that you actually need that are listed in our articles of religion and provided or expected in our lectionaries? So that rules out quite a few. It rules out the NIV. That can't be your primary. You're going to have to switch voices when you get to the ecclesiastical books, and that's not helpful. It sort of defeats the purpose when you have to keep switching like that. The fourth piece of advice. Really, when it comes down to it, use the translation that matches the prayer book that you use. Yeah, I mean, if you want to be a well-formed Christian in the Anglican tradition, use the Bible that your prayer book was meant to work with. If you use the 1928 prayer book or the 1662 prayer book, then use the King James Bible, because they were meant to go together. If you're using, I guess with the 1928 prayer book, you could also use the RSV. It was, I assume it was authorized along in the Episcopal Church, at least back then. If you're using something like the 1979 prayer book, or something from the late 20th century, the RSV might work with that pretty well. The NRSV was meant to go with things like the 1979 prayer book. Not that I endorse that prayer book anymore, but if that's what you're using, consider the Bible that matches it. If you're using the 2019 prayer book in the Anglican Church in North America, our new one, use the ESV Bible, despite the fact that it only has one edition available that has the ecclesiastical books that you need. But use, opt for it for the most part, because it's what the new prayer book was written to match. And consistency of language in your worship is very formative and very helpful. Now, if you go into some of the other Anglican provinces across the world, I've noticed some of them, like the Kenyan worship book or prayer book, has a very NIV Bible style to it. So if you're under the authority of a different province, or you're using another province's book for some reason, perhaps the NIV translation is the one that best fits that prayer book. It's something you have to look into. But that's probably the bottom line recommendation that I would have is pick a translation of the scriptures that match the style and language of the liturgy in which you worship. Now, if you use a different prayer book at home than you do at your church, in your parish, your congregation, well, okay, there's a bit more openness there in terms of what you go with. In general, I would say your daily prayers and your Bible are what is supposed to match. Perhaps there's something different on Sunday mornings for the Holy Communion service. Okay, that's fine, whatever. But make sure that your prayers, your daily prayers, your common prayer, is in the same idiom, basically, as the Bible that you read. That way you get the maximum benefit from the liturgy and from the scriptures. They reinforce one another more cleanly and more obviously. So that's my advice for choosing Bible translations. Make sure it matches your context. And if you're not an Anglican, it's very, I kind of almost started that way too. Use the prayer book. Use the prayer book anyway and become Anglican. Yes. But if you don't, use a Bible that matches the worship in your church. It's good for building unity. It's good for coherence. Unless you seriously think that your church uses a bad translation, then okay, sure, go for something better. But unity and consistency is really, really useful, especially in this age of choose your own adventure religion and buffet style Christianity. We sorely need a new dose of conformity and a dose of consistency as we build these Christian lives in a very non-Christian culture. So there you go. Bible translation choice, make it match.